Hi, everyone. It's good to see you, even if it's through a recording. It's good to be in worship together. And thank you, congregation and worship leaders, Beth and the choir, musicians, and Brad. Thanks, everybody, for coming together and being part of worship leadership today. So I had COVID this week and I'm well now, but I still could be contagious. So I'm playing it safe. So we're recording this Saturday night. So we'll see how it goes. Um, I should apologize to the Bible studies this week. I left you at your hour of need. So this week we studied Mark chapter 13, which is basically the hellscape of the whole Gospel of Mark. And it's a chapter that requires a lot of understanding and interpretation, and it's pretty dark. So, yeah, it was not a great week to miss Bible study for, but I'm sure everyone soldiered on. And here's our shot this morning to maybe make sense of some of that hellscape. Mark chapter 13 is known as the little apocalypse. So it's this little uh, glimpse of the end of times or something. Makes me wonder what a big apocalypse might be after you unpack what's going on in Mark chapter 13. How did we even get here? So last Sunday we were in Mark chapter 10, and Jesus and the disciples were on the journey to Jerusalem, their first and only trip to the big city together. In chapter 11, they arrive, and there's the famous Palm Sunday scene. So we saved Mark 11 for next Sunday. So hope to see you on Holy Week. It all begins with Palm Sunday. So then, okay, there's chapter 11 and 12 and 13. All three of those chapters take place in Jerusalem, and they're full of teaching material. Jesus is teaching there at the temple or nearby or having interactions with people, all in Jerusalem. And then Monday, Thursday, we do the chapters 14 and 15. So 13 is the last big chunk of teaching material that Jesus has. And what a way to go out. It begins with one of the disciples sounding like sort of an out of town hick. He says to Jesus, "Wow, would you look at all the temple buildings? Amazing. Wow. Look at all the buildings and the foundations, and look at how amazing they are." And Jesus responds kind of like a cool cosmopolitan traveler. He says, "Buildings, schmildings, they're all going to fall down." A little later on, Jesus and his disciple insiders, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, are overlooking the temple from the point of view of the Mount of Olives. And the four insider disciples say to Jesus, "When is all this going to happen that you're talking about with the temple?" And Jesus responds, not with a timeline, but further warnings. Jesus says there are going to be wars, there's going to be earthquakes and famines. It is going to be horrible. People are going to betray each other. You're going to be called before religious courts and beat up. You're going to be called before Roman courts and closely questioned. You're going to have personal suffering. families are going to betray other family members. And into the mix, there's going to be people who claim they are messiahs and just ones who sow confusion into this terrible, terrible time. And then there's going to be Jesus uses a very specialized term, a desolating sacrilege. And at that point, it's just going to get worse. And you need to flee if you are in Judea and hope that it's not wintertime and hope that you are not pregnant. Don't even come down if you're on top of a roof to go back in your house. Just get out of Dodge. It's going to be miserable. There's going to be suffering beyond anything that's ever been seen before. Well, great. Wonderful. Thanks, Jesus. Where is he going with all this? And then the next thing he says is what we read aloud in worship today. Jesus says, the sun is going to darken, the moon's going to darken, the stars will seem to fall, the heavens will seem to lose all their powers. Everything's going to look like it's going south. And at that moment, the Son of Man will appear in the clouds. And the Son of Man is going to send out a whole bunch of angels. And these angels are going to search every direction of the wind. They're going to search every corner of the earth and even every crevice of the heavens to find and gather those who suffer. And Jesus says, when you experience these terrible, terrible things, just as sure as when a fig tree is in its season, it is just as sure that the Son of Man is near. The Son of Man is at the gates. Then Jesus adds one more illustration into this mix in Mark chapter 13. He says, it's as if a homeowner, one who has a house, goes away on a journey, and that homeowner gives the house over to servants. Those servants are given work to do. They are to tend to their jobs. They're to be at work, and there's to be a doorkeeper, and every single person in that household needs to keep awake because you never know when the owner of that house is going to arrive. And then I'd note that in this material, at least 6 times or in 6 different ways, Jesus says, be awake, keep alert, be ready. Now, I'm always attentive to suffering, the topic of suffering and pain, and what it is, where it comes from, and how is it alleviated. So this chapter is the chapter full of the most suffering and pain. And and so some of the questioning around this chapter and material like this is, what's the timing of all this? What's the deal with all this? What's going on? And as we saw, Jesus twice says that, we don't know the timing of this. And then when he says there is timing, this is going to happen in your generation. Some of those things, war, earthquake, misinformation, it sounds like, this could have been happening in 2023. But interestingly, these markers in the story are what historians look at for dating the Gospel of Mark. When was that gospel even written? Because in year 70 AD, the temple did get destroyed in a Roman Jewish war. So there was a terrible war. And in the 60s, there was a terrible Roman emperor, Nero, who was very arbitrary. And if you didn't subscribe to his cult, he would make sure that you were persecuted. And during Nero's era, there was a fire in Rome, and Nero was looking for a scapegoats for that fire. And so he pointed to religious people, including early Christians. And it's thought that that indeed is how Peter and Paul met the end of their lives. So the immediate followers of Jesus did face hellscapes. You know, ironically, the very next chapter is their first round of hellscape. Jesus is betrayed, Jesus is arrested, and so on, led to the cross to die. But 13 seems more to prepare them for the suffering that happens after Jesus is physically taken from them. So, is Jesus's counsel about suffering and what's to happen, was it helpful? I hope it was. And I'm looking at it saying, how is this material? How did Jesus, or possibly the writer of Mark, how did they see this material as helpful for people who were about to go through extreme amounts of suffering? So, one thing I'd lift up is Jesus spells out there will be suffering. So, this is a message that a lot of times, maybe we in the US, it's a message that maybe we don't hear all the time. Maybe the message we hear is there's a ladder of success, and climb the ladder of success. And it's about success and achievement and getting more and things like that. I wonder if that kind of ideology sets us up for a particular form of suffering. Contrast this to Jesus saying, there will be suffering, wars, earthquakes, famines. There's going to be trial for you. And maybe some of this impacts the early followers of Jesus. And for people today who are in more dire situations than others, there will be suffering. But I also feel that most people have their own private hellscapes, each one a little bit different. There's kind of generic hellscapes that we can all kind of imagine and some live through, such as war or natural disaster or terrible loss, great pain, and just any amount of things. Whatever your story is, where you have felt it, it is real, and it is your thing that you get to name as suffering. And this does not make you defective or less than. It just makes you part of the community of human beings that, thank goodness, God saw fit in Jesus Christ to say, hey, I want to make sure you all know I'm in this with you. And maybe that's part of the signaling in this Mark chapter 13. into this suffering comes the Son of Man. Now, that phrase, Son of Man, is rather mysterious to us today. We've noticed up to this point, that's the way Jesus refers to himself. Or he'll talk about the Son of Man, he's often talking about himself. So, what does that mean? So, here we can travel back in time a little bit. It's a term that's found in other apocalyptic literature, this time in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel. So, the Son of Man there is this figure, an apocalyptic figure that is with the people who are suffering in that era. So part of Daniel's era included, in particular, an episode of 167 BC, a time when Hellenistic Syrian leader Antiochus Epiphanes came and he attacked the temple in his own era. And he set up a pagan idol, a desolating sacrilege in the temple. So, right here, we are learning how this chapter is echoing language from a couple hundred years before, when there was persecution, when there was war, when there was suffering. And then there was this image of this Son of Man who was with the people and helped them muster their strength and feel rescued from a time of suffering. So pivoting back to Mark 13, the Son of Man, I just love this, sends angels, and these angels know the address of every single sufferer. And so they go after and they find everybody and they gather them. So they know you don't have to be in isolation. Don't be ashamed of your suffering. Come now. Let's gather. And then there's this other sentence right in there saying that as sure as you know the season of the figs, you know that when you experience suffering, the Son of Man is there with you. The Son of Man is at the gates. So I wonder if that helped that first community of believers think about things when they were suffering. Because when we suffer, our brains just atrophy and we start to spiral, and it's hard to get a foothold. So maybe that image of the Son of Man, which was a part of people suffering before, would be there for them again. And it's going to be okay. There is going to be consolation. Maybe that visualization helped that first generation of sufferers get by. It's also analyzing that image that chapter 13 closes on, the image of the homeowner who hands off the house to the servants. And in the handing off of the house, the servants don't just sit around watching Netflix. They are given work to do in the house. They each have a task to take care of the master's house. And then there's that repetition. Don't slough off. Keep alert. Be awake. Be ready. And all this makes me think of the NCAA March Madness. Have you been watching? So, for one reason or other, there's been a team, well, almost all of them kind of win my hearts, across the game. But more recently, and it's surprising, okay, if you know me, I did not grow up a Hawkeye fan, okay? I'm sorry. Trying to be nonpartisan here, but I wasn't a Hawkeye fan. But this week, I'm a Hawkeye women's fan. Have you watched them? They are so much fun to watch. I'm going to be watching Sunday. And yeah, they made it. What is it? The Elite Eight? They made it into the Elite Eight. So, yeah, they're great to watch. Well, after the most recent game, and I just love watching athletes and what they say, what helps them, and sports psychology. At the end of the last game, an interviewer quickly asked Caitlin Clark, their like big shooter, what are you thinking about, or what's happening for you, or what are you working on in your game? And Caitlin, she didn't say, I'm working on my 3 pointers, or, I'm trying to get better on rebounds or something like that. Caitlin said she's working on mental toughness. Mental toughness. That got me thinking, is that what Jesus is coaching in Mark chapter 13? Mental toughness. To me, mental toughness acknowledges at the get go, not everything is going to go right. And so, what's your plan? I find this so helpful. And I've talked about this before. I'm also interested in literature around resilience. You know, when things don't go well, you know, we can get all caught up in that. And, we all have our things like, oh, I'm embarrassed, or oh, I feel like a failure, or oh, this is so disappointing. And I think mental toughness and resilience says, and, and, what else about that? So, there'll be suffering. Are you going to throw in the towel? Does knowing there's going to be suffering help us get a foothold and not isolate, not despair, but just acknowledge, okay, I'm on the grid. This is a thing. And I wonder if Jesus's image of that house and keeping alert is also a powerful illustration of mental toughness. Evil really knows how to go after us. Evil knows what's going to wear us out. And to counteract that, Jesus says, keep alert, be aware, be ready. Focus on your job in the house. I've left my house over to you while I am temporarily away, and I've given you a job to do. So focus on it. Don't listen to what the Jabberwockies are doing. Don't despair. Yes, there will be pain, suffering, relapse, setbacks, pain, fill in the blank. Yes. And you focus. You practice mental toughness to be about work in my household, because I need me some workers in that household. Jesus is preparing us for hellscapes. Christianity gives us a particular toolkit to deal with hellscapes. We don't have to have a very narrow philosophy of climbing the ladder and having to be a particular way or another. We can focus like laser beams on the jobs that we have been given so that we can get the ball in the basket, or we can work for the common good, and we can avoid the biggest hellscape of all, faithlessness. To God be the glory. Amen.